We are going to work on Federalist 67 today. This will be part one. Starting with this paper and the next 10, Hamilton will be talking about the executive branch. What provisions are given to the executive branch under this new Constitution, the do's and the don'ts. When you read these papers, we'll talk about them. It's very important, number one, to keep in mind that, as you remember, after Madison wrote 62 and 63, he had to go back to Virginia because the ratifying convention was going to meet there. So he had to go there and try to get elected as a delegate and go in that ratifying convention and try to do his best to persuade the people that were against the Constitution to ratify it. So Madison is in Virginia, and there are papers being written constantly in the New York newspapers against this Constitution. And as we've talked about them, these are a lot of anti-federalists, what came to be known as anti-federalists. One of these anti-federalist papers went by the name of Cato. And most historians say that's George Clinton, the governor of the state of New York, who was definitely against the new Constitution because he had it good in New York. The way the political system was set there, he had everything he wanted, he didn't want to change, so he was a strong anti-federalist. As a matter of fact, if you remember, of the 3 delegates of New York that went to the Philadelphia Convention, 2 of them walked out, 2 of the anti-federalists. It was only Hamilton that stayed for the most of the convention, not all the convention, and then became the strongest supporter of this Constitution, along with Madison and Jay. So George Clinton, under the pseudonym Cato, published as a paper, and he does Hamilton a great favor. He makes one error. He says that in case there's a vacancy in the Senate of the United States, the president gets to nominate who fills that vacancy, which is not the case. Remember, as we've talked about it this past few papers, it was the state legislatures that appointed the senators of the states. It wasn't even the people directly. And in the Constitution it says so. When you read this paper, you'll see that. So this is the biggest gift to Hamilton. And Hamilton here even uses the word shameless. And he says, look, these anti-federalists, you can't trust them because not only they don't have a good argument, but they're making up things, making up stuff. And I'm here to prove it to you. So it was a God-given for Publius, for the authors of the Federalist. So keep that in mind. This paper is a lot of rhetoric about these people who think that we're going to elect a president that's going to be like corrupt, like the King of Britain or King of France, even worse than that. There's going to be pomp and glory in the court. This is going to be almost like a king we are electing. And that's what most of this paper is. So when we read it, just big words about making fun of the anti-federalists for saying that the American president is going to be a king, which is totally wrong. So I haven't been editorializing here during the reading of these papers. I've just been reading the text and making a little comment. But here, let me just give you a little something to think about. If George Washington had not been there in the Philadelphia Convention, and if most of those delegates were did not know, or at least if they would think that anybody other than George Washington was going to be the first president of the United States, willing to bet you that either the Constitution wouldn't have been written and ratified, or if it were written, it would be such a totally different Constitution that you would not even make sense of it. So I've mentioned it in my translations when I've translated the Federalist Papers to Farsi. I've mentioned it there many times, so I feel like it's unfair if I don't tell you what I think. I think the fact that George Washington was the leader of the American Revolution, at least in the military side, and then he actually resigned his commission after the war. He didn't say, I want to be a king, I want to be an emperor, like our little Napoleon on the other side of the ocean would. He gained a lot of credibility. Because of that, everybody knew he was going to be the first president. And it's very, very important. Now, most historians don't tell you this. And like I said, this is editorializing. This is my opinion, okay? From what I've read, from what I know. We are very lucky that he did not have a son. Now, his wife, the lady he married, did have a son, but it was not his own son, okay? And we were very lucky because the chances are that he would not have been elected, because people back then were very watchful of what was going on. Because look at the first 6, 7 presidents of the United States. The only one that had a son was John Adams. And guess what? His son became the president of the United States, John Quincy Adams. So we are lucky in a sense that somebody like George Washington was there during the Revolutionary War. He resigned his office and he had a good enough character to step aside, and then another good enough character that as president he stepped aside after 2 terms. So set up an example, and we're very lucky that he did not have a son. Okay, now sometimes I make a mistake because I have introduced a lot of books to the listeners in my translations of the Federalist Papers that I have put on YouTube and Facebook. And here I forget to mention some of the books that are not mentioned on those sheets of paper I show you, or I've shown you on these videos. Number one, it's very important, if you have access to it, and I know one day it'll be easily available, the introduction to all the different editions of the Federalist. Read the introductions by the scholar who has edited it, okay? It's very important, because you'll get different takes on it. This is by Jacob E. Cook. This one was the Oxford Classics. I showed this when we were doing Federalist 66. It's got a good introduction, and all of them have good bibliographies, the books that you should go to once you want to delve deeper and learn more. Like one of the little books, I've mentioned this professor's name quite a bit, Rakoff, but he's got this little book on James Madison. It's really good, and it's got a good bibliography. It's called James Madison and the Creation of the American Republic. Look at the bibliography at the end of this work, and look at the bibliography at the end of this Oxford Classic edition of the Federalist Papers. There are 3 books. This scholar I have not told you much about because I've said a lot about him in the translation of Federalist videos. Forrest MacDonald. There's an interview with him on C-SPAN on one of their in-depth programs for 3 hours. He was one of the first scholars that challenged Charles Beard's take on the founders. So if you can, read his books. If you can't, just see what interviews there are with him. He did an interview with Bill Moyers years ago. Of course, he's on C-SPAN. So if you can, read his books, Forrest McDonald. And these are two of the important books: Ideological Origins of the American Revolution by Bernard Bailyn, and Creation of the American Republic by Gordon Wood. I've mentioned his name many times here. So these are some of the books that you have to read them if you want to delve deeper. If you can't, watch some of their lectures. There's plenty of them available. Another scholar that's like this Federalist edition of Federalist that I'm reading from right now, and I've said it's got a good footnotes to it. It's J.R. Pole, J.R.P.O.L.E. He's also got a couple of good books on the American Revolution and the founding. So take a look at those and you'll benefit a lot from them. And I better start reading this in part 2 then.